We now come to the core part of the speech synthesis process, namely the generation of the speech signal. In the course of time, different approaches have been used for generating speech signals, some based on rules, other based on data, some using parametric descriptions of speech signals, other non-parametric ones. And in summary, 4 approaches have been proven to be practically relevant and are still in use for generating speech signals. These are the so-called parametric synthesis, the concatenative synthesis, which comes with a decent flavor of unit selection synthesis, and several approaches to statistical synthesis. In the following, I would like to shed some light on these 4 main approaches, which are organized in the way they have been introduced in history. So we will start with the oldest one, which is the parametric synthesizer. The idea is to use a model of the speech production process, for example, the here depicted source filter model, and feed that model with parameter values which can be determined by rules. For example, a vowel can be generated with a certain fundamental frequency, so we have to put a value to the fundamental frequency. A consonant may be generated with some noise excitation signal. We can combine the amount of energy in the voiced and unvoiced excitation parts, and we can define the central values and the width of the formants for generating the vocal tract information. So in principle, if we have values for these parameters, we can synthesize a speech signal on that basis. These parametric synthesizers, they are very flexible, they are rather easy to implement, and they were the first ones being implemented. But unfortunately, the model of the source filter to produce speech is rather simplistic. It does not model the exact shape of my vocal tract over time. It does not exactly model the behavior of my excitation. And thus, the speech which is generated with such a parametric approach is rather artificial, sounds rather computer-like. In order to overcome this limitation, people have thought about using real, naturally recorded speech signals and concatenate them in order to form arbitrary new speech sequences. And the most popular of the approaches for concatenative synthesis was based on a pitch synchronous overlap and add approach, or so-called PSOLA approach. It starts from units which contain transitions between phones, so usually diphones or triphones. Normally diphones are used. So we have the transition of phones in a naturally recorded speech signal. And then for this transition of phones, the pitch markers are determined. These are the moments in time when the glottis opens. And you need to have a rather exact labeling of these instances of time. And then around these pitch markers, little snippets of the speech signal are cut out. You see these little snippets, which are cut out with a rather smooth window in order to not create artifacts. These little snippets contain the structure of the vocal tract information, that is the phone information in my speech signal, but they can be combined in a rather arbitrary way by changing the fundamental frequency, making more little snippets fit into a certain time frame, by changing the amplitude, amplifying or attenuating the little snippets, and also by lengthening or shortening the certain parts of the speech signal. That is, I can make the word longer or shorter, or the sound longer or shorter in a word. That is, all the 3 parameters which are relevant for prosody, namely the fundamental frequency, the energy, and the duration, can be manipulated with this pitch synchronous overlap and then add approach. And the adding is just by adding these reproduced little snippets into a new speech signal. The newly produced speech signal still contains the same vocal tract information, but the prosodic information is different. And with the help of such an approach, we can produce arbitrary speech signals from these little transitions. Now, with diphones, you can imagine that the number of combinations of two phones is rather limited. So this would result in a rather limited inventory of speech units you need to have in order to synthesize all possible words in a certain language. So this is a small footprint synthesizer. Usually uses diphones or other small units, but it comes at the expense that we have to manipulate the speech signal quite heavily. That is, we have to cut out at each period marker little snippets and have to overlay and add them in a new rhythm. This manipulation makes a speech signal produced by such a concatenative approach, although it basically consists of pre-recorded units, makes sounded a little bit unnatural. The voice quality is different from a normal speech signal. And that really comes from the manipulation of the signal during the process. In order to overcome this limitation, people have thought of using longer units where you don't have to concatenate so much, ideally words or combinations of words or even phrases, even sentences. And that means that you have to have, of course, far more of these units because you have longer units. And if you want to produce arbitrary speech signals, you need to have all possible words in your inventory, basically. The clue of this approach is then that you have to select from that inventory those units which best represent the speech signal to be generated by minimizing the manipulation of the prosodic information in the speech signal. So ideally, you would have different instances of a particular word, for example, one with a rising prosodic contour and another one with a falling prosodic contour and another one with a neutral prosodic contour in your inventory. So even for the same word, you need different instances in order to have as few as possible costs in terms of prosodic costs. These are costs which are particularly important when you concatenate two units, because at the concatenation point, if you have a jump in the fundamental frequency, this would be something perceptually very unpleasant. So the mathematical approach underlying such a unit selection synthesizer is to define costs for the concatenation points of two units and also costs for how close the units you found in your inventory is to what you actually want to synthesize. So whether it's a fitting unit or not so well fitting unit. These are called the target costs. By summing up the concatenation costs and the target costs, you can basically determine a cost function. And by minimizing the cost function, you can try to identify those units which provide a best fit to the text you would like to synthesize. This unit selection approach already points that there is a kind of optimization problem in terms of sequences in the synthesis process. So the synthesis process can be considered as finding an optimum sequence of signal representations, here in terms of units, given a sequence of symbolic descriptions. These are the ones extracted from my symbolic textual preprocessing. The problem is that the input and the output come at different paces. The input vectors come at the pace of the linguistic incoming information, for example, at the pace of phonemes or of words or functions in a certain sentence. The output vectors need to come at a fixed pace in order to generate signals with a fixed frame rate. So you have a mapping problem between the input vectors and the output vectors, which needs to be taken into account in such a statistical signal generation process. But there are a number of well-known statistical approaches for solving this problem, and you have learned about two of them already in the chapter about automatic speech recognition, namely hidden Markov models, HMMs, or neural networks, NNs. As mentioned, the input information consists of features which are calculated on the symbolic level. For example, on the level of the sentence, like the length, the number of words in a sentence. On the phrase level, the intonation contour, for example. the word level, what function this word has, the so-called part of speech, the grammar, on the syllable level, the stress and the tone of a certain word, down to phone level, voicing and manner of pronunciation. So all these are categorical features which serve as input and are summarized in terms of an input vector sequence for the sequence to be generated. Now, from this input vector, we have to resolve two problems. The first is a sequencing problem, because the input and the output vectors need to be aligned. The output needs to be produced at the pace of the signal, so in a fixed frame rate. This is also equivalent to duration modeling. The second problem is that for each of the input vectors, we need to determine numerical parameter values in order to realize, to synthesize, to generate the speech signal itself. And these values need to be predicted from the mostly categorical phoneme or context information. A first approach for resolving these two problems is to use a hidden Markov model for the sequencing part and a linear regression tree for the value prediction part. This combined approach is usually termed as hidden Markov model-based synthesis or HMM-based synthesis. Also, a better term would be regression and HMM synthesis. And an example of such an approach can be seen in the picture behind me, consisting of an upper part which illustrates the training process and a lower part which illustrates the synthesis process. In the training process, a large speech database is used in order to find context corresponding parameter values, that's in this upper part here, both for the excitation, or the voicing part, and the vocal tract, the shaping part. And at the same time, the corresponding input labels are extracted from the speech data. And with all that combined information, a hidden Markov model is trained. This trained hidden Markov model is then used in the synthesis part. In the synthesis part, we take an arbitrary input text, we analyze it using the same analysis chain here, and from these labels and from the pre-trained hidden Markov model states, we try to generate parameter values using a linear regression tree. And these parameter values again affect the excitation signal and the vocal tract. And then this can be used in order to synthesize speech. So in the sequencing process, the states of the hidden Markov model represent units at a phone level or usually at a subphone level. Usually we take here 5 states per phone instead of 3 states we have used in the ASR process. The HMM states generate output vectors by transiting from state to state, and also self-transitions are possible. That is, a model can stay in the same state in order to have a rather lengthy representation of that vector. Unfortunately, the number of possible contexts between phones is rather large, and not for all of them we have enough training material. That is why in the training process a little trick is applied, namely that we pool training examples of similar classes into so-called tied states. From these HMMs, the parameter values are then predicted using regression trees. So using linguistic information at the decision points, parameter values are predicted usually in terms of Gaussian distributions, meaning Gaussian means and variances for each of the parameter values. This approach works quite nicely, but it has two distinct problems. The first is that the linear regression tree for generating the parameter values is a rather simplistic model. It cannot model nonlinearities. The second is the generation problem at the output layer, because we are still using a rather simplistic model like a source filter model for generating the speech signal. But instead of a rule-based approach as we have applied in a parametric synthesizer, here we use a trained, a data-driven model in order to feed the parameter values. But the model itself remains basically the same. A possible solution to overcome both of these problems is to use deep neural networks instead of the hidden Markov model and the linear regression trees. Deep neural networks are better in modeling nonlinearities, as we have seen, but in turn, a separate duration model is necessary for the sequencing part, because we don't have any longer Gaussian value modeling as with the linear regression trees. Still, neural network-based synthesizers have been very popular in recent years, and many of them replace the handcrafted text processing pipeline, which we have used for the text preprocessing, also by a neural network, which is an encoder subnet, then replace the duration modeling by an attention mechanism, which we also know from automatic speech recognition, and then replace the vocoder signal generation by another neural network, for example, the WaveNet signal generation. And an approach which uses all this together is a sequence-to-sequence neural network synthesizer, which is called Tacotron 2, and which you see depicted on this slide. At the lower end of the picture, you see the input encoder network, which starts from the input text and replaces the manual preprocessing pipeline by neural networks on the textual, on the linguistic layer, with different layers. And you see also that there is some time sequence modeling in terms of bidirectional LSTMs included here. As an outcome of this network, we have location-sensitive attention mechanisms, which are forwarded to this decoder network, which you see up here, and which produces MEL spectrograms as representations of the speech signal. And these MEL spectrograms have to be transformed into waveforms, and this is done with another neural network called WaveNet. So you see that in this approach, all steps of the synthesis pipeline are done with the help of deep neural networks, including time sequence modeling and attention mechanisms. This most recent approach to text-to-speech synthesis still has to prove that it is general enough, but it seems to be very promising at the moment, although of course you need large training material in order to train such an approach and to adapt it particularly to particular speakers to produce certain voices of desired characteristics.